Hello and welcome everyone to the last law session of today, which is called Right to Privacy Online. And as a moderator, I'm glad to present Professor Katrin Nimman-Metcalf, who is a professor specializing on law and technology at the Tallinn University of Technology. She has also been advising various organizations and nations on issues regarding ICT, privacy, freedom of expression, and so forth. So thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, you had a short coffee break now, no fault of ours, but I'm sure this wonderful panel will be worth it, so that it was worth hurrying with your coffee. We're going to do it slightly differently. We're going to do so that I'm going to give each speaker 17 minutes. And then after the papers, we will take one or two short questions that directly link to that paper. So this will be if you have some points of clarification or something like that. And then after all the three papers, we're going to have a discussion where you can ask all the three presenters, because by that time you will have also seen the differences perhaps between their approaches. So we will have that discussion at the end. So if you have these more sort of conceptual issues that come to mind, then save them till the very end. But if you have direct questions to the three speakers, I think I don't need to say much to take time about the importance of this issue. I think everybody who in any way has anything to do with the cyber world will have thought about the question of privacy. And it is also, I think, clear to anybody who's ever thought about it that it's not easy. And it's a question which very clearly demonstrates these different aspects that we have to think about. There tends to be sort of trends when there is a big sort of leak of something, or we find out about some surveillance, then there tends to be a sort of popular outrage and people talk about privacy. Next week comes a terrorist attack and people talk about the importance of having more control. Privacy seems to take the back seat, and this is what our three wonderful speakers are going to help us to understand a little bit about the complexities and make us have some new ideas and maybe know a little bit better afterwards what should be the correct answer then. I will introduce them briefly and then we'll take them in the order of the program. So our first speaker will be Mr. Ido Sivan-Sevilla, who is a research fellow at the Hebrew University, and he has background both as computer and social scientist. He has worked in the private sector, the public sector, and the military. So he covers pretty much everything. And he's going to talk to us about the dynamic trade-off, security and privacy, exactly this trade-off I very briefly mentioned, but specifically looking at the US over a period of time. So a very interesting paper that you have also in the book that actually practically helps us to see how this has fluctuated. Next speaker will be Eliza Watt, who is at the University of Westminster, where she's a lecturer and also doing a doctoral research. But she is also a barrister, although not practicing at the moment, and a consultant, so has legal experience and will tell us about the role of international human rights law in the protection of online privacy. And from her very interesting paper, also in the book, you'll see that she's going to give us some concrete suggestions on how this could be better phrased and sort of given a different kind of context. And then the third speaker is Lucy Purdon, who is going to put this all into a more practical context. Lucy comes from an NGO which is called the Privacy International, which is, I think, probably the oldest NGO to actually deal with this issue. Started dealing with it already in the 1990s, if I'm not completely wrong, so before most of us even thought we would ever have a problem with privacy. And she's a policy officer there, has worked for the Global South, but she also is a filmmaker. So she comes in from a completely different aspect of life in that sense, but has a strong human rights background as well. And her paper is not in the book, as far as I know, and she's going to talk about cybersecurity and privacy, giving the Tin Man a heart. So that's what we will end up getting a heart into this debate. But without further ado, Ido, sorry, if you would like to start with your 17 minutes, I will be very tough, the time, so please.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm very happy to be here, looking forward for a lively discussion. So we're going to discuss security and privacy in cyberspace by US laws and regulation. This is an extensive study in the past 5 decades. And you can see at the upper right corner, I put a spoiler. We're going to empirically uncover the dual role of the state in cyberspace. US strengthens cybersecurity and privacy from one end, but at the same time undermines privacy and to some extent cybersecurity for greater, so to speak, national security and law enforcement goals. What's our research problem? So technology has fundamentally changed the relationships between security and privacy as we know them in democracies. From one hand, technology increased the conflict between security and privacy, right? Governments moved from targeted surveillance, handpicking the targets you want to do surveillance about, to mass surveillance thanks to technology. Think about all the information we leave after us, face recognition techniques, car plates, and we can go on. So many examples of these mass surveillance practices. But at the same time, and surprisingly not being spoken enough, technology is also a great platform to advance both security and privacy at the same time, right? And this is quite obvious. If cyberspace is more secure, the privacy of the individuals who process their information online increases as well. And the point of this study is to look at 2 desirable goals over time that complement and conflict, and this is rarely done in the public policy literature, and this is one of the things that we're trying to do today. So why is this important? Why should we care? So we all know that privacy is gradually eroding in the digital age. It's like this nice guy who always finishes last, right? We really love him, he's really nice, but there's always other interests that overrides privacy. It's not only security. Privacy loses to efficiency, privacy loses to financial gains, and of course, privacy loses to interest of security. And why this is bad news: if you care about your anonymity, if you care about your liberty, if you care about having a boundary between the public and the private, you want to have privacy. It's a protection against abuses of power, and it's a fundamental characteristic for a healthy democracy. At the same time, we all love security, right? Security is the basic platform to which we can enjoy all other rights. It's beyond physical safety. It provides certainty, freedom from fears, assurance that will not be harmed. It's fundamental to a functioning state. So we have healthy democracy on one hand and a functioning state on the other. And the relationships between these 2 important goals are being decided today. This is why the sense of urgency is clear. There is a theoretical scholarship in public policy called historical institutionalism. To put a long story short, it says that arbitrary policy decision at the beginning of a policy course shape the way the policy will develop. And these decisions are being made right now, and that is why understanding these relationships is important. Okay, so what happened to these goals over time? Like we said, we lost control over our personal information. Google, Facebook cameras, we can go on, many examples there. Targeted surveillance became mass surveillance. The importance of court warrants are diminishing, right? Before we had a judge between, losses of privacy and government desires. Now, gradually, the importance of judges is leaving the agenda. Privacy is no longer for granted, but rather controlled by states and societies. At the same time, security threats can origin from anywhere, right? States move from mitigation strategy, to preventive strategy. We're trying to collect everything to understand from where the security threats can arise. And like we said, protecting cyberspace means advancing both. So what's our methodology? We'll look at 5 decades of US federal policy. Why do we study the US? Well, the US has a rich history with privacy tensions. It sets the agenda in terms of technology. It's a liberal democracy from one hand with enormous intelligence capabilities on the other, and trying to understand how the 2 integrate is important. Why we study on the federal level? So this is a central arena. A lot of it happening at the state level as well, but we want to choose one important central arena to understand how this evolves. When do you start? How do you start to assess these relationships? So it turned out that 1967 was not only a great year for the Beatles or Jimi Hendrix, but also for this relationship between security and privacy. There was a landmark Supreme Court decision that provides constitutional protection for privacy. And strikingly, surprisingly, at the same year, the RAND Research Institute published its first ever study on security and privacy risk of information systems. And all these events triggered a lot of policy event to start the study from. What exactly do you look at? So we look at the tension between security and privacy, not privacy with other values, and only on laws and regulation that construct some kind of dynamics between security and privacy. Okay, so after filtering our events, we're left with 70 policy events. This means legislation, executive orders, national security directive, mandatory agency guidelines, anything you can think of that construct the relationships. We classify it to a 2x2 table. At the upper left corner, we have this is the good, so to speak, good events where security and privacy complements, mainly in the cyber security and data protection arena. The upper right corners are 26 events where security overrides privacy. These are the events that are in the news, Snowden, etc. The government either extend its legal authority or alter technological infrastructure to increase security over privacy. At the lower left corner, we have, believe it or not, 16 events that limit security to some extent for privacy purposes. You see that mainly in the 70s and the 80s, and now post-Snowden, we start seeing that coming back. Places where security and privacy are both downgraded were not visible for us in the data. So what's happening over time? I don't expect you to look at all the details here. Just remember that blue ones are acts that limit security for privacy. Red ones are where security overrides privacy. And I want us to put this a little bit in context. Let's sense what's going on here over time. So we had this landmark Supreme Court decision in 67. We had Watergate, the Watergate scandal in 72, a big political surveillance scandal by President Nixon in the United States. And this led to a great outcry. That is why you see some blues in the 70s and 80s blue events. And then at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, encryption and digital phone switches appear. This was terrifying for surveillance agencies. It really hurt their surveillance capabilities. So you see a lot of red events that trying to alter encryption and change technological infrastructure in the United States. 9/11 happened, and this led to an enormous extension of what the country can do in terms of collecting information. It was a systematic reduction of all the privacy laws that they had before. We can mention the Patriot Act. We can mention the President's surveillance program, so secret programs by President Bush that ran for 6 years, unlawfully and secretly, domestically surveilling on all U.S. citizens. And then Snowden came in 2013, and Snowden had an impact on regulation. You can see that here. After several decades, start seeing some significant blue limitations on national security for privacy. And this summarizes this trend. As you can see, a V trend. You see more privacy in the 70s and 80s, a lot of more securities in the 90s and 2000s, either for technological changes or extending what the government can do legally. And at the end, blue events that, again, after Snowden, the post-Snowden era, we're starting to see some limitations on that. Let's try to assess how the actors act. So the executive at the 60s and 70s was rather weak. Surveillance scandals were exposed by the 1976 Church Committee in the United States. They told the public about tremendous surveillance practices by then head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, unbelievable things that were done to surveil on Americans for national security purposes. This outcry, this made the executive rather weak, and Congress was able to limit it to some extent. Since the 90s, war on terrorism, technology, the executive dominates the surveillance agenda secretly, without any oversight, unlawfully, and through temporary programs that usually become permanent. And like we said, Congress was able to limit the executive, but then they work together to erode the wall between law enforcement and national security. Business groups, and that's very, very interesting. Privacy was a selling point at the 70s and 80s. The business industry wanted privacy to sell products to their customers. This has changed completely. In the 90s, businesses were secretly cooperating with the government for national security. But recently, this is starting to change, right? The Apple FBI case, the Microsoft case about the data in Ireland. You see businesses, understanding again that privacy and selling and business and civil society are starting to work together, and this is good news for pro-privacy advocates. Okay, but like we said, it's not all bad news, right? We have many places where security and privacy complements. Unfortunately, on 50% of the cases, it's only about the federal sector. So the government is doing really well in protecting the federal networks. The health sector, the financial sector are protected as well, but other sectors are not as protected as they should be. And this is a cumulative diagram that demonstrates that. In red, you see at the x-axis, you see the years. At the y-axis, you see the number of the regulatory measures. You see a lot of red. This is protection on federal networks. The blue ones are protection on health and financial sectors. And you can roughly see some green in 2015, 2016 at agency levels, but they're mostly voluntary and not protecting enough. Two important points in time to remember. So 1974, Congress passes the Privacy Act that says what the government can do with private information. Private sector companies were able to be exempt from regulation at this very important point. 1967, the internet economy is booming. President Clinton, Vice President Gore, publishing a framework saying that we're going to have no regulation or oversight on the internet economy. It's the future. We need to develop, not pose costly regulation. And to these events, designed this so-called path of commodification of personal information that we see today. And this is troubling. The last finding, which I find interesting as well, we do see variance in how privacy and security relate to each other when you talk about different policy arenas. So if you're in the law enforcement arena, you see that Congress is dominating the process. You see a multi-stakeholder process. You see that things are more publicly open. Everyone has a voice on the decision-making table trying to conduct a compromise between security and privacy, and we have very interesting examples on that. But when you move to the national security policy arena, you see a concentrated and secret decision-making processes, security crisis, or surveillance scandals. These are the ones who drive national security policies forward. You see a misleading use of language, very little scrutiny by Congress. You see that businesses are either secretly cooperating with the government or even hacked by the government to get information from them. A lot of abuses of power, unfortunately, take place. And when you move to the cybersecurity arena, you see a great conflict between national security and commercial interest. And you see it across spectrum from the 80s onward until today. This arena is rife with agency that dominate the agenda. Private sector, like we said, is traditionally exempt from regulation. And policymakers, in fact, are very reluctant to pass cybersecurity regulations that will either curtail surveillance capabilities or hamper commercial interests. So commercial interest versus national security, this is the conflict that shaped the arena, and it leads to only categorical and marginal promotion of security and privacy. Let's conclude. So what are the takeaways? 4 things to take from these policy trends. First, I think that this research demonstrates the urgency of changing the discourse over cyberspace. The state as a double agent really excels in utilizing cyberspace for its own purposes, but doesn't do well enough to adequately protect it. The relationship between security and privacy are very context-based, very ad hoc based, and this has a profound, like we said, profound implications on democracy. There's no clear strategy here. Events happen and you respond. We should shape cyberspace as a common good, right? Rather than expanding surveillance with very lax accountability, we should increase individual security and consider cybersecurity of users rather than systems, and ask ourselves whether collecting everything really makes us safe. Empirical studies say, of course, otherwise. And the last conclusion, we should inject transparency in the process, give ownership back to the data subject, encourage encryption, liability, and accountability. And I think the morning session we had with the Microsoft official is really big news, because you hear a very significant private actor saying we need a non-government agency to oversight what's going on. And I think this is a very encouraging and a very important step in the right direction. And we have to listen more to the voices other than those of security or commercial interest. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting, really. So, as I said, if there are a couple of questions now directly about the issues, some questions of facts. Yes, we have one over there. I think the microphone will move there in the middle. And please also say who you are. It's always interesting to know who the person is who's asking the questions. So.
Augustin Marinelli, United States Naval Academy. So people in the U.S. seem to be very concerned about the government collecting this type of data, but they don't seem to be very concerned about the private sector gathering this data and then monetizing it for their own purposes. Did your research get any insight as to why that seeming contradiction exists?
Yes, there's a great discrepancy there, right? We don't like the government surveilling on us, but if it's done perfectly, that's okay. I think it's rooted with the U.S. history. The U.S., throughout its history, was terrified by government surveillance. It's protected in the Constitution. You see a lot of public outcries in the 70s and 80s that government surveillance is bad. Private sector surveillance, and it's quite striking, was kind of backdoor developed like in the margin. It wasn't that big. Google didn't do it at the beginning. Google only became profitable in 2006 when it decided to conduct the commodification of personal information. So this has happened like in the background, but I think this is starting to change. At the same time, people like the convenience of using private products. They don't see it as a big brother as they see the government. I think it's kind of a cultural thing in the US. It's a very good point.
One quick follow-up.
Yes.
Do you think anything could change that? Like, I mean, are we one big, say, Facebook data breach away from people being scared of the private sector, or not?
So commercial interests are very strong in US regulatory regimes throughout sectors, not only in cyberspace. So commercial companies, business, the US was born based on businesses leading the way and businesses not being regulated or constrained by the government. It's very rooted in the US regulatory history. It might happen that Facebook breach would change that. I'm not so sure that the lobby is huge. The monopoly power of these companies is enormous. They're bigger than many, many states in the world. Unfortunately, I don't see it change in the future. I do think that we should inject transparency, though, to the processes. You know, the cliche that sunlight is the best disinfectant. I think this is true here as well, and I'm hoping that this will be our step in the right direction. Thank you.
I have another question. Yes, please, in the middle there.
Hi, good afternoon. Robert Dewar from the Centre for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. I'm taking the opportunity to ask a political science, political theory question because we don't often get the chance to do that at CyCon. You mentioned historical institutionalism, the idea of path dependence, and the path dependency is kind of being broken by what Krasner called punctuation points. And I see throughout your presentation that there are these punctuation points that have pushed policy either further towards security over privacy or back the way towards privacy over security. That being said, you also mentioned a lot that to explain things that are happening now in particularly US policy, we need to look back to its history and why it's done certain things. I was wondering how much in the research you're doing, you look at functionalism and neo-functionalist approaches, this idea of a spillover from one particular decision being made that, rather than being a path-dependent process, has opened the door to other ways of doing things as a result of this, particularly with regards to surveillance. The idea of mission creep as a spillover is a very, very important aspect. If you take a decision to surveil for one particular reason, then a precedent has been set in order to surveil anyway, then you can go, okay, we'll just add this thing to it, we'll just add this thing to it, we'll just add this thing to it, and then eventually through a snowball effect you end up with mass surveillance. Now that, I realize that doesn't answer any or have any kind of bearing on cyber conflict, etc. But it helps to differentiate why certain policies have been adopted further down the line rather than just relying on, you know, we have this particular approach, that decision was made then and it's continued. It actually, the thing actually grows itself, particularly with privacy and surveillance.
I think first I also encourage the ability to inject political science and public policy theories to the cyberspace discourse. I think this is missing in the literature as well, and this research aimed to do that more a little bit because I think we have a lot to learn about these policies right? These are researchers who study policies, across the globe in many domains. Let's apply it on cyber as well, even though cyber, as we all know, is very, very unique. I think the punctuations that you mentioned are very interesting. They happen only in contradictory relationship between security and privacy. These are not where things are more complementary. And the functionalism path that you mentioned, I think you do see that when you look at the details, when you look at high resolution of how surveillance is advancing. You see how FISA courts, the intelligence courts in the United States, they approve surveillance requests once. They're very controversial, and then just this is the path that it follows. So I think that the big punctuations happen across 20, 30 years maybe, and these light points also explain how this actually expanding. And one of the things that now FISA Act is about, the 702 Act is about to get reformed, one of the things they talk about is let's have more transparency on past decisions. Let's understand what was the big of the controversy that you chose to decide on these surveillance requests, so we know how this evolved, how we got to this point that we are today. So I think functionalism is a very useful prism to inspect things in the legals, the high resolution of the surveillance regime.
Okay. Thank you. And as I said, we will have a chance to ask questions also after all the three presentations. So thank you again to Ida. And now we move on to Eliza's 17 minutes of fame. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you.
presentation.
So first of all, thank you for having me for today's panel. My presentation focuses on the role of international human rights law with respect to protecting online privacy, in particular in the context of state-sponsored foreign cyber surveillance. So first I would like to start by saying that there can be no doubt that untargeted mass foreign cyber surveillance undermines the right to privacy of communications under international human rights law, in particular under Article 17 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Some states have actually advocated for a hard law solution to this problem in a form of an additional protocol to Article 17 for the digital sphere. My own view is actually that is quite ambitious, number one, and number two, it would very much depend on the political will of the international community for that to come to fruition. However, there are complementary methods of achieving strengthening online privacy. And one of those methods is the process of modernization of the already existing international human rights framework, in particular by the UN Human Rights Committee modernizing the framework by replacement of the already existing and outdated General Comment number 16 to Article 17. So I should like to actually, in particular, focus today on just one aspect of this process, and that is how exactly are human rights treaties to apply to state-sponsored cyber surveillance. So first I would actually outline the scope of application of both the Covenant and the Convention. I should set out the domestic legal basis upon which some of the states conduct their global cyber surveillance, set out the effective control test and explain why it is problematic when applied to cyber surveillance, and then come in favor the virtual control test, because at the end of the day, one way or the other, we are all foreigners in cyberspace. So the jurisdictional scope of the Covenant is contained in Article 2, and according to that article, states owe to individuals who are within their territories and subject to their jurisdiction the duty to respect and to ensure human rights. Similarly, under Article 1 of the European Convention of Human Rights, states are under obligation to respect human rights and protect them with regards to the individuals who are within states' jurisdiction. The domestic legal basis upon which some states conduct, or most states conduct their global cyber surveillance, differentiate between external and internal communications, as is the case, for example, with Section 8 of the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, and soon to be replaced by the Investigatory Powers Act 2016, and communications of nationals and non-nationals. So in the case of the surveillance of internal communications or communications of nationals, obviously the procedural guarantees are greater in that they have to be conducted on the basis of a warrant that, for example, specifies a particular individual or set of premises subject to surveillance, whereas that obviously is not the case with the interception of external communications or communications of non-nationals. Yet, doubts exist as to whether making such a distinction, it actually is justifiable in the context of digital communications. And I should like to give two examples of that. First of all, in Privacy International and GCHQ, the UK government actually admitted that the definition of external communications extends every time a UK resident uses such platforms as, for example, Google, or Facebook or Twitter, because these companies are actually headquartered outside of the United Kingdom. Similarly, the NSA, in its own internal review, has actually admitted that technologically, it's almost impossible to differentiate between foreign and domestic surveillance collection when collecting that communication under the upstream program pursuant to Section 702. Therefore, the question arises as to what exactly are the obligations under the human rights treaties of the intelligence services when conducting their surveillance activities. Some states, in particular the United States, take a narrow view with regards to the scope of application of the covenant outside of its territory, in that they read Article 2 through the prism of Article 31 of the Vienna Convention of the Law of the Treaties, which requires the treaties to be read in accordance with their ordinary meaning. And note on that reading, both conditions in Article 2 have to be read conjunctively, in that an individual has to be both within the state's jurisdiction and also on its territory for the state to incur human rights obligations under the covenant with regards to that individual, which in effect actually excludes the extraterritorial application of the covenant altogether. Another example is also of the narrow reading, is also the recent Investigatory Powers Tribunal decision of 2017 in the Human Rights Watch, where the tribunal held that UK government doesn't have Article 8 obligations with respect to foreigners who were outside of the United Kingdom with respect to their electronic communications, which were obviously collected and intercepted while they were traveling through the United Kingdom's territory. However, this narrow view can be contrasted with the more expansive view taken by most of international courts and human rights bodies. For example, the International Court of Justice, the Human Rights Committee, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and as well as the European Court of Human Rights, all hold that human rights treaties actually apply extraterritorially. And to that end, a similar test has emerged, known as the effective control test, to determine jurisdiction. So, for example, the Human Rights Committee stated that states have a duty to respect and to ensure human rights to everyone who is within a power and effective control of a state, notwithstanding whether that individual is actually within the state's territory or not. And this can be seen also in the case of Lopez and Uruguay. So the effective control test then gave rise to two models of jurisdiction, the spatial model and the personal model. The spatial model triggers state's jurisdiction where a state has got effective control and power of a particular geographical area in a foreign territory, and normally this would arise as a result of military operations. And that was the case in Lizardu and Turkey. The Strasbourg court in Bankovic and Belgium stated that extraterritorial application of the human rights treaties, in that particular case it was the convention, is an exception. However, if a state has effective control over a particular area and its inhabitants through assuming some or most of the public powers of a state, then obviously that would trigger jurisdiction too. Furthermore, under the personal model, a state would actually owe human rights obligations also on the basis of state agents acting abroad through exerting power over individuals. And this normally is actually understood as a physical power over that individual, as can be seen, for example, in Lopez and Uruguay. In General Comment number 31, the Human Rights Committee stated that human rights treaties cannot be interpreted in such a way as to allow human rights violations abroad, where the same violations would be prohibited from occurring in a state's territory. But most interestingly, the European Court of Human Rights also seems to be moving towards the personal model and away from the spatial model as enunciated in Bankovic in Belgium. And 4 cases actually illustrate this point: the O'Callaghan, Issa, Al-Sakini, and Jaloud. So what O'Callaghan, Issa, and Al-Sakini have in common is actually state agents exercising authority and power over an individual in the context of detention operations, through actually having physical custody over that individual. In Al-Sakini, this was in the context of a formal detention center, whereas in O'Callaghan, this was actually outside of a formal detention center in an airport, in a foreign territory. In Jaloud, the Strasbourg court went even further and actually developed the personal model of jurisdiction, stating that it is not necessary for state agents to exercise physical control over an individual. As a matter of fact, if a state is held to exercise rights and control and authority over an individual's rights, then the jurisdiction would be triggered. In other words, the state would be held accountable for human rights violations. And in that case, it was the states having control and authority over an individual, the applicant's right to life as he passed through the checkpoint manned by the Netherlands service personnel. So the question that actually is of importance is the effective control test really, as if understood as a spatial and a personal model, really suitable to be applied in the context of cyber surveillance activities? Always, as we all know, communications in cyberspace travel through multiple jurisdictions to reach their destination. That is obviously done in purpose. So in effect, communications are opened to being intercepted by many actors and many state agencies. And therefore, the effective control model is particularly problematic because if applied as a physical control test, an intercepting state cannot be really said to have power or control over a particular geographical area where they're conducting the interception, the surveillance, or indeed can be said to have or to assume any public powers of a sovereign in that state. Equally, when applied as a personal model, it cannot really be said in any seriousness that the intelligence agencies exercise physical authority or have physical custody over individuals who they're intercepting. Reading someone's emails cannot be equated to that level of control. I would put to you that the power of the intelligence services is more virtual and digital than physical. And it actually demonstrates itself by the ability of many states to intercept communications, to break encryption, to have direct access to communications through, for example, a relationship with the private sector, but also obviously directly tapping the underwater cables to gain access to communications. The level of scrutiny is unprecedented, and it not only does have effect on the right to privacy, but also has got effect or chilling effect on other rights, such as, for example, freedom of expression and opinion. So the question is, what kind of control and what level of control is needed to establish jurisdiction? Well, states have duality of obligations under human rights treaties. They have a duty to respect. In other words, they have to themselves refrain from human rights violations, also known as the negative duty, and they have a duty to protect individuals from human rights violations by others, also known as the positive duty. So some commentators actually conceptualized jurisdiction in the context of foreign cyber surveillance as the negative duty not to interfere with communications. And this is the case with the so-called interface-based jurisdiction, and also as conceptualized by Dr. Milanovic, who said, actually states would have a duty to refrain from interference if there is no sufficient justification. And although that sort of more or less covers most of the base, it leaves at least one gap, and that is with regards to collusion for circumvention, which is described by the Council of Europe as the secretive arrangements among the intelligence agencies to conduct surveillance on each other's territories and nationals, and then share that information in circumvention of their own national laws. So to me, at least, it seems that the virtual control test is more applicable and would close that gap. So this is understood, or this would make the covenant and the convention applicable when a state has got control over individuals' communications, notwithstanding having control over physical control over a particular area or physical person. But I would actually extend this test even further. And I would say that if a state can be shown to have control and authority over individuals' right to privacy, then that state would actually incur both the positive duty to protect and the negative duty to refrain. So if conceptualized in that way, it would certainly be perhaps more in line with the unprecedented capabilities of some states who can intercept, store, monitor, decrypt communications of all of those individuals who are not within the state's territories, but whose communications are notoriously collected and who are not really suspected of any wrongdoing. It would also seem to be in line with the notion of control, which has been developed by the human rights courts and bodies. But in this case, it would be actually modified to reflect the remote control as against the physical control. Furthermore, it would be in line with the more permissive model of jurisdiction as enunciated recently by the Strasbourg court in Jalut. However, even if the tests were adopted and adapted, it would still be just an exception to the territoriality principle as confirmed in Al-Sakini by the European Court of Human Rights. Furthermore, even if it were accepted by the Human Rights Committee and included in the new general comment, it would still be only an opinion of a group of experts, non-legally binding and not necessarily actually representing the position of the states on the issue. Having said that, most of the UN organizations, human rights treaty bodies, as well as the group of experts responsible for drafting of the recent Tallinn Manual, the latest Tallinn Manual, agreed that human rights treaties do apply in the context of extraterritorial cyber surveillance. The point is when and how. The effective control test has not actually been thrashed out, so to speak. So in conclusion, I would say the international law obviously applies to online as much as offline, and we all know that. Intelligence agencies must be able to do work to keep us all safe, especially so in the light of the recent terrorist attacks in Europe. To be able to do that, they must have clear norms. Not only must they be able to adhere to their domestic law, but that domestic law must actually also be in line with the international obligations of states. At the moment, it is still very unclear as to when and how human rights obligations would be triggered, especially in the context of extraterritorial cyber surveillance. The effective control test seems to have its limitations, and I would advocate that it actually has to be modernized and made to fit this new reality, whether through the Human Rights Committee updating General Comment 16, or indeed, even if one day we would have a new binding privacy convention or treaty. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eliza. And we do the same, so a couple of short questions, if there are any questions specifically to Eliza. You realize you have to raise your hands very high because we're being blinded by this blue light. I see somebody there, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Kubo Mačák. I'm a lecturer at the University of Exeter. This is something I'm still trying to think about, so you might tell me that there is an easy answer. But basically, when you're saying that everyone can be subject to jurisdiction for the purposes of this virtual control test, so anytime that the state has this ability to assert control over their communication, how does that square with the long-standing understanding that espionage, in the sense of foreign espionage, is not unlawful under international law? So would that mean that anytime states engage, and let's put aside the question of economic espionage. Russell, who sits next to me, he has a good paper about how espionage sometimes can amount to violation of non-intervention. Let's put that aside, but let's just focus on political espionage as such, which has always been seen as permissible, not regulated by international law. So how does that square with your argument? Does that mean we need to revisit this understanding, or is there a way around?
A very interesting question. I don't think that actually we need to square that. My understanding, obviously, peacetime cyber espionage is, you say it's not unlawful. I think that the position of international law on the issue is pretty much undecided. It occupies a gray area in international law. It's neither prohibited nor is it permitted. Now, obviously, espionage activities have recently really been augmented to, in a way, absorb this new emergent cyber espionage. Cyber surveillance seems to be actually forming part of the category of cyber espionage. In my own mind, I think that in terms of law, of which part of, or what area of law should apply, first of all, we actually have to make a clear distinction between cyber espionage and cyber surveillance. To me, they are related, but they're not the same. And in that sense, if we actually have this clear distinction, then it would be easier to, in effect, regulate the activities of the intelligence agencies, and as it were, almost ring-fence individuals from the breaches of privacy that stem from this industrial scale complex, as it was defined or described by the Council of Europe, which, by the way, had actually also proposed to ban mass cyber surveillance and not necessarily proposed to ban cyber espionage. So the point is that under international law, yes, there is no, this has not been at all, as it were, addressed. Well, at least with international human rights law, we know that it does apply online and offline, and everyone agrees with that. So again, if we started from the beginning, from the very defining what cyber surveillance is, I think it would be then easier to try to then, sort of, as it were, apply human rights treaties to that, and in the circumstances of when that could be possible.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. One more question, if there is one. Okay, yes, I see somebody in the middle there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Laura Grisa, Estonian MOD. So I had a question regarding the two tests you proposed.
Mm-hmm.
So both in the effective control and the virtual control, the word control and its meaning still remains. So how do you see, how do you see in the context of the virtual surveillance also being able to simply look at the traffic that's going on? So from what point would you say that the state exercises control over the actions of persons simply by having an oversight of their information?
Again, a very good question. I think that the starting point would be the surveillance jurisprudence. I think we are very lucky in Europe in that the European Court of Human Rights has got a very developed and robust jurisprudence on that issue. In particular, the recent cases, for example, of Zakharov and Russia, Szabo and Hungary. And so I would say that there shouldn't be, in the context of digital communications, this is a point I need to stress, there shouldn't really be this distinction in the domestic legislation between interception of foreign communications and domestic communications. It no longer makes sense. It was maybe fine, at the beginning of the last century, where most of those laws, domestic laws, were put into place, but it's no longer the case. So therefore, I would advocate, following Zakharov, that all interception should actually be done on the premise of the same procedural guarantees. So reasonable suspicion every time. And therefore, then, you as an intelligence agency acting on the basis of the same warrant, and you have to fulfill the same procedural obligations, whether you are intercepting foreign communications or domestic traffic. Because as we learned from Privacy International and also NSA, it's very, very hard to really make that difference when they are collecting the traffic. That is the digital traffic.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, so another applause, I think, for a life-changing paper. So, Lucy, tell us what it really looks like.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much to my fellow speakers and to CyCon for the invitation, and to the amazing team at CyCon for getting me here as well. Thank you for that. The paper I'm going to draw on for this presentation isn't in the book because it was published yesterday, but it is on our website. And I wanted to give you a bit of a perspective of what's happening on the ground with regards to cybersecurity around the world, and tell you a bit about Privacy International's work with our network of partners, highlight some of the challenges that we're facing and how we're responding to those challenges. So Privacy International defends privacy worldwide. We hold government and industry to account and demand meaningful protections and safeguards. Privacy is a fundamental right and will be increasingly essential to freedom in a data-driven world. And we believe that for liberty to thrive, both technology and law must secure our right to privacy. And we believe that privacy and security are both essential to protecting individuals, including their autonomy and dignity. And technological systems must support and enhance privacy, not undermine it. Laws or practices must not compel individuals or organizations to undermine their security or the security they provide to the users who place their trust in them. So Privacy International has partners in 16 countries in the global south, and last year we worked with each partner to produce a state of privacy report in their country, looking at legal frameworks around privacy, surveillance, data protection, ID schemes, and cybersecurity, among others. And all these reports are on our website as well. And many partners identified that cybersecurity is a priority of their government, but also identified a lot of weird things being done in the name of cybersecurity, including repressive laws that undermine both security and privacy. So, for example, using encrypted messaging services is illegal in Pakistan, and using them in Morocco will land you in prison and a $10,000 fine. The Computer Misuse Act in Uganda has been used to criminally charge a journalist investigating government corruption. And worryingly, some governments often bundle regulation of online expression under the banner of cybersecurity. So, for example, the Computer Crimes Act in Thailand has been used to prosecute cases of lèse-majesté involving expression about the royal family that's perceived as negative. So these examples demonstrate how some governments frame cybersecurity under their own preferred terms and to match their political aims. And by doing this, they put both privacy and security at risk. Because if a government prioritizes policing online behavior, surveillance of content, or censorship as cybersecurity issues, it's likely to weaken rather than strengthen security. There's a good chance that essential work will be under-resourced or ignored, such as identifying vulnerabilities, securing critical infrastructure, and supporting security research. And as the WannaCry malware attack demonstrated a few weeks ago, as seen on this infection map, security is a global responsibility, and we all need to be on the same page. So Privacy International and our partners have observed that governments are keen to develop data-intensive projects, but lack consideration for securing the data those projects generate. For example, some countries without any data protection laws are developing projects including smart cities like India and Indonesia, or biometric voter registration systems like in Kenya, which are potentially very intrusive. And data breaches continue globally, and the numbers involved are staggering. In 2016, the personal information of over 93 million voters in Mexico, including home addresses, were published openly on the internet after being taken from a poorly secured database. This could be highly sensitive information. In Mexico, for instance, there are gross abuses of rights, including up to 100,000 people reportedly kidnapped each year. Similarly, the personal information of over 55 Filipino voters were made publicly available, which was the biggest data breach in the Philippines' history. And a database containing the records of 650,000 patients in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, was made public, putting people at a variety of risks, from becoming victims of identity theft to persecution, for example, when the identities of women undergoing abortions were exposed. So in sum, companies and governments build systems, devices, networks, and services that generate and accumulate vast data stores without proper regard to risk, security, or data minimization. And with no legal obligations to protect personal data against unauthorized access, there will be consequences, as many people are left vulnerable to excessive data being collected on them, and that data is poorly secured and ultimately stolen. And data breaches have a knock-on effect for a country's cybersecurity, as they cause people to lose trust in systems, cost the economy greatly, and direct resources towards retrospectively securing systems that should have been secure from the outset. And despite all these risks, the people with the skills, expertise, and knowledge to help are often frozen out of the conversation or even criminalized. Independent security researchers with those skills and expertise to test security features and discover vulnerabilities are often prevented legally from doing so, even under the protection of institutions like universities. So, for example, to test a company's assurances that a phone is secure, an independent researcher may be breaking the law or the terms of service of the technology. And there are many examples of researchers being arrested or threatened with arrest for discovering and exposing vulnerabilities, particularly in the systems of big business. So it's important to acknowledge the contribution, for example, by researchers in the story of the WannaCry malware, because they collaboratively and voluntarily analysed the malware in action, and the young British researcher known as Malware Tech who helped slow its spread. So instead of prohibiting or discouraging the identification of security weaknesses, which is in the public interest, skilled individuals who can do this need to be incentivized and encouraged so that adversaries with the same skills do not deploy them to undermine individuals' security and privacy. And Privacy International is, of course, not the only organization that believes human rights are at the heart of cybersecurity. Yet civil society organizations and independent technical experts are largely frozen out of the conversation when it comes to deciding on cybersecurity priorities, policies, and laws. And in many countries, there is currently little transparency on how decisions regarding cybersecurity strategies and cybercrime laws are made and by whom. Civil society and technologists rarely have a seat at the decision-making table. Cybersecurity should be considered a public good in the same way as public health, which promotes collective responsibility for the benefit of everyone. And in a cybersecurity context, securing the individual helps secure everyone. So with this in mind, Privacy International believes that protecting and defending individuals, devices, and networks should form the basis of any cybersecurity strategy. They are interlinked and interdependent. And defending security means having to get all of this right simultaneously. Examples of all three of these failing together are evident in almost every major cyber attack. So firstly, protecting individuals. And I don't think I'm going to say what you think I'm going to say. But yes, lack of basic cyber hygiene and lack of awareness of social engineering methods are the most frequent ways that security is compromised and individuals, devices, and networks fail to be protected. But while educational and awareness-raising programs on these risks are important, governments tend to overly focus on the individual as the weakest link, as a threat to cybersecurity whose behavior needs to be fixed. But cybersecurity is about more than trying to convince people to change their online habits that leave them vulnerable to fraud, scams, or phishing. And putting the onus on individuals to protect themselves plays down the responsibility of companies, governments, and other stakeholders. For example, companies need to design their products and services with privacy and security embedded at the earliest stages. Governments and regulators need to create, shall we say, incentives for this to happen. And protecting individuals is closely tied with protecting devices. Increasingly, our devices are being connected to the internet at an alarming rate, and as the amount of data they store increases, security mechanisms don't. And while there's significant focus on devices such as smartphones and computers, there is a need to look more closely at other devices. As is frequently reported, the list of products connected to the internet grows every day, commonly known as the Internet of Things. A massive amount of data can be stored on these devices or accessed via these devices. So securing them should therefore be a key cybersecurity objective, both for the risk they pose in relation to the personal data they generate, collect, and transmit, and for the security risks they pose as integrated in or as part of a network. And while it's cheap to connect any device to the internet, it's generally agreed among security experts the security of these devices are very poor. Many devices have no or default passwords and are difficult or even impossible for everyday users to change. Therefore, many of these internet-connected devices are vulnerable and in turn a potential threat to personal and network security. So policymakers and regulators need to address how they will encourage manufacturers to make devices more secure, particularly when there's currently no market incentive to do so. Regulators need to have better tools to monitor and ensure compliance with standards of security and privacy, and civil society need to ready itself to present the case for change. Software updates do not just apply to an individual's device, but also those running on a network, such as a router. If a device is compromised, a whole network is at risk. And so protecting networks is the third piece of the puzzle. Good network security means reducing the attack surface and then allowing the right people through the right devices to access the right services on a network and keeping everyone and everything else out. And protecting and defending a network can mean protecting a home Wi-Fi connection, a company's intranet, a telecommunications network accessed by the public, a bank's network, an industrial control system, or nation's critical infrastructure such as a power grid. So people, devices, network. This should be considered a priority approach to cybersecurity. And this is before we even get to the more nuanced discussions, for example, about 0 days and the stockpiling of vulnerabilities. But don't get me wrong, security is hard, really hard. And when we fail, which we will, we need to fail well, and that means failing safely. But at the moment, there's no incentive to fail well. And because the law is lagging behind and technology is steaming ahead, it leads organizations to take matters into their own hands. So, as I said earlier, at Privacy International, we don't like to blame end users. We get really nervous when we hear our partners being advised that in order to protect their privacy and security, they should use Tor, they should use Signal. This pushes responsibility onto the end user to secure themselves only with tools, which ultimately leaves them vulnerable. It doesn't matter how secure or insecure the endpoints are if the organization's infrastructure itself is insecure. So we believe it's not enough to concentrate on the endpoint. We need to look at organizational security and an organization's network as a whole. So we've developed our own network that runs on an in-house piece of software called ThornSec. So I'm not a technologist, but as it's important that we all begin to understand the technology that's all around us, I'm going to try and explain it. So the reason that ThornSec was developed was twofold. Firstly, as an NGO, we face challenges in the same way that any SME does when it comes to tech. Technology is expensive, it's not easy to find, and until recently was not even considered in funding models. Therefore, our internal systems were often left unmaintained and bordering on insecure. And it was clear we needed an automated way to check systems were up to date. And as my colleague said to me, when defending a network, you have to get it right all the time. The attacker only needs to get it right once. Secondly, we were observing increased targeted attacks against NGOs around the world and the need for a solution to address insecure systems. Whilst attacks can be crippling to a commercial business, it can be life-threatening for an NGO, especially ones that expose powerful institutions. The information held by an NGO could potentially lead to arrests, kidnappings, or even deaths if it was to be released. And this is a huge concern for us at Privacy International, not just for ourselves and our wider network of partners, but also civil society organizations everywhere. And this came to a head for us in February 2016, when the decision was taken to shut down all of our internal services because we felt they were insecure. Only email remained. No website, file sharing, project management, calendar, VPN, nothing. And this is how ThornSec was developed. So this is the science bit. ThornSec is an in-house piece of software that is secure by default and an automated way to deploy, test, and audit internal and external services for an organization. And we're using this software for all of our services: email, website, calendar, project management, Tor hidden services, VPNs, everything. So in a nutshell, we're protecting our internal services by ensuring that nothing can talk to each other. For example, the computers can talk to printers, but the printer can't talk back if it's uninvited. Each device and service is isolated. This means that if a device was compromised, it wouldn't spread throughout the entire network. And our technologists were so horrified by how insecure the ISP's router was that was supplied to us when we got our account, they put another one in between it and our services. And the whole system runs on 2 servers called Snowden and Chelsea, and the whole cost is around $600. We've identified several of our partners in the Global South that we intend to roll this out to as well. So not only is it a technological initiative, it's also changing the culture of the organization. All 27 of us now have increased understanding of how our organization runs technically, which gives us ownership over our network, and we all play our part. We even install our own root certificates. It's taken the pressure off our tech team. They're not just seen as tech support, they are a research team. And I'm not saying this is easy, but it's greatly influenced all areas of our work and our understanding of technology. The simplicity of the idea of ThornSec has made us realize what it means to be secure and how our devices and services are betraying us. Devices and services talking to each other to collect data, often unnecessary for the function, is making us vulnerable. So by stripping away everything apart from what is essential for our services to run, has demonstrated to us the areas we should be pushing government and regulators to act. Individuals, devices, networks. And all this stemmed from a firm belief that privacy is at the heart of cybersecurity. So, to sum up, good cybersecurity policies and practices put people and their rights at the center rather than undermining them. Cybersecurity should be considered a public good in the same way as public health. In a cybersecurity context, securing the individual helps secure everyone. When we argue for security, we argue for security for data, individuals, devices, and networks. When governments argue for security, they're often arguing for something different, often focusing on criminalizing behavior through repressive cybercrime laws rather than the root problem of insecure systems. Governments largely prioritize surveillance systems over secure networks and criminalize those with the very skills that can help make us safer. Governments turn on technology and try to break the tools that enable security and privacy to flourish, such as encryption. Companies and governments build systems, devices, networks, and services that accumulate vast data stores without proper regard to risk, security, or data minimization. This ultimately makes people less secure. So in prioritizing the individual and protecting people, devices, and networks, governments could take advantage of a real opportunity to give something very technically complex a human element. In short, giving the Tin Man a heart. Until this landscape improves, cybersecurity will suffer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. First, to stick to the sort of order of things, a couple of small questions maybe to Lucy, and then we also open up to a discussion with everybody. But I think first, if there's any sort of clarifications or any comments directly to Lucy, we would take those first.
I'll do my best to answer technical questions.
Yes, we have something over there. Yes.
How exactly would you compel, say, an authoritarian regime to, to impose cybersecurity? Because I mean, in some countries, I guess, you could do it through public advocacy and civil society, but in an authoritarian regime, they have an incentive to do the opposite. Technology's been a boon for them, for monitoring people. How would you compel those countries to comply?
So, well, under the human rights, we start with human rights obligations, and then also we try and get the companies involved to go that way as well. In terms of what we're rolling out to our partners in terms of ThornSec is trying to get people to understand a bit more how to protect themselves as well, and understand more about their organizational security. But yes, you're right, compelling authoritarian regimes is not something that's going to happen. The channels that are open to us, we are using, but because technology is just leaping ahead of laws, we're trying to get organizations to protect themselves as well. So in the Global South, we have 16 partners, and they're across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That's kind of global. Yeah, some of the legal work we do, because we're a UK-based organisation, Eliza mentioned some of the cases that we've taken against GCHQ. So we do a lot of legal work in the UK, not so much in the US at the moment, but we work globally, yeah.
Any other question? I see one over there.
Hi, Andrew Carell from Pipedrive. I was wondering, for your custom software that you have written for your network, is it open source? Has
Yes.
it been vetted? And where could it be found?
I would have to get back to you on where it would be found and how it's vetted, but yes, it is open source.
Okay, that's good.
1 out of 3, not bad.
Okay, good. You didn't have too many technical questions. Okay, wonderful. Thank you to everybody for being short, to the point. I managed to intimidate you enough to not dare to go over time, which means that we now have about 20 minutes for general questions and for a discussion also among yourselves. And while the audience is getting ready with all their questions, I would first perhaps give the floor to you, if you have any questions or comments to one another. And maybe first speaker, if you have anything to any of your co-speakers, please.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Eliza, I have some questions. I read your very interesting paper. And 2 points comes into mind. First, and like you mentioned, there's the attribution problem. I mean, what is the extent of the teeth, so to speak, of international law when it's so problematic to prove where cyber espionage is coming from? We know it mainly from disclosures and whistleblowers, etc. But I'm thinking, would it actually deter nations to conduct cyber espionage if they know they're overriding international law? I don't know. Maybe it is, but maybe you can say something about it. And second point that I'll be happy to hear your thoughts is the obligation of countries to privacy of foreign citizens. I think this is a very nuanced case. I know that after Snowden, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Committee in the United States conducted a report. They talked about that. They didn't reach a clear conclusion, and I'm wondering, what do you think about that?
Okay, so let me just perhaps try to answer the first question, and that related to the idea of attribution, yes, and in the context of cyber espionage. So I think again, what I am trying to do is actually address the particular problem of cyber surveillance as against cyber espionage. I think we need to understand that states have conducted espionage since the times began. It's been termed the second oldest profession in the world. We all know that. And it happens for a variety of reasons. These days, obviously, the tools have changed, and it's much easier for a lot of nations to be able to conduct acts of espionage, including, for example, the intellectual property thefts and all sorts of activities of that nature. But I am actually specifically relating to the cyber surveillance activities, and we know the usual suspects. And these are the states who actually have the capabilities of doing so. Yes, I know that a lot of nations perhaps also conduct surveillance activities on each other's nationals, but there's a group of states, you know, we all heard of the Five Eyes, who actually are particularly eager to collect information on their own nationals and obviously abroad. And so I think as far as the attribution is concerned, international law, I don't think it's actually, it is such a problem, because in fact it would, if there is a need to address that problem, it's actually through perhaps augmenting existing international human rights law to actually cater for this sort of capability. And I am not just saying, I'm not only addressing the idea of revamping the rights of privacy of communications under the covenant or the convention, but I am also thinking perhaps of greater security of data, in other words, data privacy. There is one European instrument to that effect, which is Convention 108, that actually addresses that problem. And in effect, it would be very helpful if the basic premise of that convention actually became more of a global standard. And second question, I have to confess, I can't remember. So you have to repeat that, please.
It was about the obligation or responsibility of the privacy of foreign citizens by these five nations you mentioned.
Yes. I think that it comes down to the point of justification. We all know that human rights, the right to privacy is not absolute. We know that states can conduct surveillance under the premise of, say, in Article 8, if that surveillance is actually justifiable. In other words, they can. It's not as though the right to privacy is, yes, it's absolute. It's not. So the point is that, yes, of course it can be breached, but on particular legal basis. In other words, if it is in the interest of national security and all of the other grants that are, for example, provided in Article 8, paragraph 2. I think in this case, the point is that I find it very difficult to really square the provisions of the Article 8, in particular with respect to such things as necessity and proportionality, with the all-encompassing collection all the time, this idea of collecting all the haystacks all the time, just in case. And we know that, in particular, the European Code of Human Rights is actually very much against the fishing expeditions. So, in effect, again, what I am saying is the law has to try to somehow get a handle on it, but from what is happening on the ground, and in particular in relation to the fact that, yes, we are faced with the increased terrorism. The point is that whatever human rights bodies are advocating and what are governments doing are just parallel universes. They do not, they unfortunately do not coincide. And I think in many respects, I fear that we are very much fighting a losing battle, because the scale of what is going on, in my own mind, is just not going to lessen. If anything, it would actually increase, as for example, can be seen through the provisions in the Investigatory Powers Act 2016, which I don't want to get into that one because I don't want to waste more of your time. Thank you.
Let's take some questions from the audience, perhaps, and then come back to questions from the other panelists to each other, so we make sure we get time for audience questions. I see somebody in the back there.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's been any...
Please say who you are.
Yeah, my name's Oliver Parsons. I'm with NATO, U.S. Cyber Defense Committee. Wonder if there's any thought about the increase, and you just made a good point about it increasing because of the evolution of AI and how that will affect privacy as well, and also the freedom that people continuously, I won't talk about Facebook or any of those, but the type of freedom people use to just put their information out there. You've got Google Talk, you've got Amazon, Alexa, all these are collecting information freely and willingly being given to those particular devices and systems. So,
yeah, I think maybe if we have one more question, we can take two, then it's time for me. I have to see somebody there.
Yes, I was just wondering, as an individual, it is fairly easy to imagine that my data has been swept up in potentially illegal surveillance situations. But also as an individual, I can't prove that because I'm not privy to such information as exactly who was swept up in, for example, NSA mass gathering. What is an individual what can an individual do to hold their governments accountable? And I guess this would go across, like, also if you were one of these Mexicans who had their voter information released. Is there anything that individuals can do to kind of hold their governments accountable for these situations?
Okay, I think, I don't know, Lucy, maybe you want to start?
Sure. So AI and giving information freely to devices. I think what part of the problem is that we actually don't know a lot of the time what information is being given to devices. We can kind of imagine, but we don't actually know. And that's a huge problem, especially when it comes to data protection. So data protection has a huge problem at the moment because we just don't know what kind of personal data, if it is personal, if it isn't, that's being swept up by a lot of these devices. And AI also complicates that as well, because it's not necessarily, I mean, it's a problem for data protection because it's not necessarily the data that you are giving, it's the insights that companies or whoever is getting from that data. So this kind of falls between the cracks of data protection as well. It's something that we're working on internally. I think a lot of people are trying to get to grips with what this means for us. And so yeah, it's an ongoing problem. But yeah, I'm very, very aware of the problems it highlights. In terms of again, another data protection thing, in terms of those big data breaches that I mentioned, a lot of these countries don't have data protection laws or an information commissioner that can hold them to account. So it is a really big problem, which is why I was kind of, in that presentation, going towards trying to get more secure systems rather than just relying on the law to kind of to protect people in this case, because it's just not happening. And in terms of holding an individual holding a government accountable for any surveillance that you might have been involved in, at Privacy International, we did launch a case a couple of years ago with the Investigatory Powers Tribunal in the UK, which was unsuccessful, not surprisingly. But again, and this just shows that even when there are the channels to challenge unlawful surveillance, it just isn't, it's not quite there. It's very, very difficult for an individual to get recourse about that, unless something goes up to the European Court of Human Rights. Right. And there is a judgment which is pretty influential, actually. Yeah. But that is, you know, I mean, there's been one or two over the past couple of years. But yeah, it's very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I would be happy to address the 3 points that were mentioned. I think first, you know, our tendency to voluntarily share information. So recently, the Director of National Intelligence of the United States published guidelines that limit what the CIA can do with publicly shared information. So I think it's a step in the right direction. I think it's, you know, it's the conflict between enjoying all these services and, you know, building our online presence from one hand, and from the other, all the data analytics that you can do through this data. So no good news here, but these new 2017 DNI guidelines are certainly an important step. The AI problem fuels the privacy problem, obviously. Machine learning is going to predict what is it that we want. It's going to narrow the things we can choose from. It's going to conduct a very specific course for what we choose to do. And there's an interesting trend now in Washington, D.C. It's called public interest technologies. You see this in think tanks in Washington. You see this in Congress. Recently, Congress appointed Chris Sunnigan, which is a huge critic about U.S. Surveillance policies. He's now part of committees in Congress trying to fuel the debate towards public interest cyberspace. There's this process of the vulnerability equities process. You found a vulnerability. What do you do with it? You patch it. You save it to yourself. What's the difference between an exploit and a vulnerability? There's a lot of boundaries between the two. So I think this is not going to solve the problem, but this is a step at the right direction. And whether I can hold my government accountable, I think eventually you cannot. I think it's an even a more basic problem. Even if we face a data breach, we're not always getting compensated. And I think all the rise of the insurance industry trying to spreading the risk, the third-party risks from data breaches is important. And we still do not have a federal breach notification law in the United States. And hopefully when this will come, it will fuel the insurance industry, and this will help solve at least that first step towards holding someone accountable.
And I think what I would add to that is with regards to an individual's remedies. Obviously, in the UK, yes, the situation is quite problematic in that you could take GCHQ and all other sister agencies to the Investigative Powers Tribunal. However, there is no appeal system from that court. That's number one. Fortunately, you can always try to take your case to the European Court of Human Rights. Unfortunately, since Zakharov, the idea of the principle of standing, in other words, who can and on what basis can actually bring a case, has been much relaxed. Zakharov confirmed that, unlike in the US under the Clapper case, where obviously that would be a lot more difficult. However, a question is, what happens if the UK decides to leave the convention, which apparently might be on the cards? I think that would make an individual's right to access to courts and remedy a lot more problematic. With regards to the Internet of Things situation, I think, from my perspective, it's a scary thought, because especially in the UK, as I think I mentioned that maybe to someone, maybe you are in the audience, I think we are all used to the fact in the UK that when we step out of our front door, we know that one way or the other we would be subject to surveillance, whether it is CCTV or whatever else. Surveillance has not yet come to our homes, in that we can close the door and we can still have some degree of privacy. When the Internet of Things comes our way, then that would not be a case. Imagine, for example, watching television and having cookies device. Scary thought. So I think what really also needs to be looked at from the international human rights perspective, and I am saying international human rights because it's a global problem, is actually the accountability of the private sector for human rights violations, which obviously now it's a total vacuum. International private firms do not have binding human rights law obligations. It only relates to states. So the private sector, I think that needs to be very seriously addressed. What was the third question?
Well, I think you answered it. Was the question of the individuals?
Yes.
Yeah. That was the yeah. Yes. Okay, I think we have 3 more minutes or 2 more minutes, so I think we could have time for either a couple of more questions from the audience, if there are any, or if there was any of the other panelists who had any questions. But I think we give priority to the audience if somebody has something. I have plenty of questions, but I'm sort of holding back if others should. But did Eliza or Lucy have any questions to one another or to Ida? Or?
I was actually wondering, because obviously I read your paper, and it seems as though the US policies, I think there is a disconnect between obviously the privacy protection and the securitarization. Mm-hmm. And to me, it seems as though, in particular in the US, the pendulum has actually swung very much towards cybersecurity, but from a perspective of, protecting national security, mm-hmm. and very much at the expense of privacy. Do you think that pendulum will ever swing back again, especially as we know that after the Watergate scandal, this issue had been actually quite robustly addressed with the Church Commission, and obviously certain legislation that follows suit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the security establishment in the US is huge. It has enormous powers and influence. It's amazing. You see that at 1984, the president gave NSA responsibility over cybersecurity. Congress debated that, said, no, we don't want intelligence, hovering our computers, and it gave it to NIST, the civilian agency. And 2 years afterwards, you see a memorandum of understanding between NSA and the NIST that practically brings back NSA to the influential position. You saw that in 1989. You see this in 2010. They had another memo in 2010 that NIST got responsibilities and NSA took them back. So history shows that NSA is too powerful at the moment to change that discourse. But I think maybe sessions like this will help change it eventually.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I will take the opportunity then, as I sort of by default have the floor, to ask you something, maybe a sort of final point. Does there have to be a trade-off? Do we have to choose between security and privacy? Because isn't it so that if we actually have better protection for our privacy, we have more trust, and we feel like you mentioned transparency. I think all of you mentioned transparency at least once, and if we have that, we actually trust, and that increases our security. So is it definitely a trade-off, or is that just a kind of easy way of looking at it?
I never use the trade-off. I never talk about that because I think it's unhelpful, and I think every time it is spoken about, it comes with before someone from the government says we need to break encryption or we need to do this, that something would undermine both. So it just, you know, I don't like to use it. I mean, like Eliza said, privacy is a qualified right. You know, there are circumstances where our privacy rights are not protected. Isn't that enough? Like we've already got it. So what, you know, what is? I just find the language very unhelpful as we try and move forward. And I agree with my panelists, my fellow panelists saying, you know, privacy and security are important reinforcers of each other.
And I also think that, you know, directly after the Snowden revelations, in particular, I think that then Foreign Secretary William Hague made a number of interesting observations. One of those was, if you have nothing to hide, you should have nothing to fear, which obviously posits security and privacy as polar opposites, which obviously is, I do have a problem with that, because in effect states have both obligations. They have a duty to protect us, and they have a duty to keep certain information private. If they don't, I mean, the point is, yes, it is a qualified right. It's not as though there are no circumstances where they cannot breach our privacy. So in effect, to posit that is not really necessarily presenting the whole situation to the societies, because in effect we shouldn't be in a position where we must choose, especially if increased surveillance really doesn't achieve the goals which the governments are purporting that they do.
Final word, or?
I think
Everything's been said.
Yes, I think we all have something to hide, and I hope it stays that way, right? This is fundamental to a healthy society, to be able to have a private face and a public face. I think it's very, very important, and eroding that boundary is dangerous for democracy. And I hope I hope we're not there yet, and I hope we won't get there at the future.
Okay, I think that was a great ending. So let's give a hand again to our wonderful panelists.
Thank you.